Hello friends and welcome back to my channel, His Grace Abounds. I hope this video finds you well. Today we are going to make sourdough ciabatta. This is one of the easiest breads in my opinion to get started when just dipping your toes in the water with sourdough. So we're starting here, as you saw in my jar, with what I call scrapings. That was about a tablespoon in the bottom and then whatever was left on the sides. So I do not follow specific increments when feeding my starter. The important thing to know is your starter is a bunch of small yeast and bacteria. So when you're feeding it, then you have to keep in mind if you have a lot of starter, you have to feed a lot of flour and water. If you have a little bit of starter, you can feed it less and it takes a longer time to grow. So I had a very little amount of starter here, but I fed it a lot. So you can see here this feeding time right now is at 8:20 in the morning. I'm going to set it on my oven here in a warm spot and let it start to get active. It is important to have a fairly active starter before you start baking because that will affect your rise time. So you can see here this is now 12:50, so this is 4 hours later and the starter is already very active and bubbly. It hasn't risen and doubled past that rubber band line until now, and this is 1:50, so only an hour later, and it's even more active. We see lots of bubbles, and in the top of the jar in the side of the jar, you can see here where it has risen above that rubber band line. So we're at 3 o'clock in the afternoon now, and ideally your starter would double in about 2 to 4 hours. Here it took a little bit longer because we fed a large amount of flour and water to a small amount of starter. So it took a longer time for us to see the effects that they were making as they were feeding. So now we're going to get started mixing our dough. You're going to add 320 grams or around 1.5 cups of water, 2 teaspoons of salt, 100 grams or about half a cup of active starter, 450 grams or about 3.5 cups of all-purpose flour or bread flour. You can use either. So you can see here, and I'm showing you that my starter is floating around in the top of the water. So some people will tell you that your starter has to float to bake with and to give you a good rise, and that's not always the case, but it is sort of a best practice. So I bake with starter straight from the fridge often, and the starter still raises my bread. However, it takes a little bit longer because you're thinking about it as, again, you have your yeast and bacteria and they're feeding. So whether you're feeding your starter or you're putting starter in a bowl of flour and water, you're still feeding those yeast and bacteria. So as you do that, they're going to become more active and raise your bread. The timing and the heat or lack of heat, warmth, is going to affect that as well. So yeast and bacteria feed, and sugar is also helpful. So you could also, as they're feeding on the flour, you could also include a little bit of honey or sugar, but it's not necessary. So then also heat is a factor. So if you need to increase your rising time, you could put it in a warm oven with the light on, but not a hot oven because the heat will kill your yeast and bacteria. So you can see here I've mixed it together just with my Danish whisk here. It's called a dough whisk. It is very scraggly and lumpy. It's breaking apart, but we're going to let this sit for about 30 minutes. All right, y'all, so we're going to do our first series of stretch and folds here. This dough is a higher hydration, just meaning that it has a lot of water and it's a little bit of a wetter dough, so it can be harder to handle. So if you wet the tips of your fingers, this makes it a little easier and it makes the dough stick to your fingers a little less. Stretching and folding is very simple. You literally pick up the side of the dough like you saw me do. You stretch it up and fold it over the dough. All right, so now we are going to continue these stretch and folds every 30 minutes over the next 2 hours. So that's going to be 4 in total. Now, this is not an exact science. You just want to get to the dough every 30 minutes to an hour or so and give it some stretch and folds and turn it over like I'm doing here. This creates big air pockets and big holes. That is the classic sourdough style bread with the big holes and air pockets and a very light crumb. And they call that an open crumb. So we're just going to develop the gluten here and strengthen the dough by doing this. Sometimes I get to all 4 stretch and folds, and sometimes it gets forgotten and I get it once or twice. It all just depends on what's going on that day. It's very flexible, and your bread will still turn out very well, even if you don't get all of these done perfectly every 30 minutes over the 2-hour period. This sourdough in general is a long fermented dough. So that means that it's going to sit and rise over a long period of time. And as those yeast and bacteria feed on that flour and those dough ingredients, they are going to develop the gluten for you. So as you can see here, the first time we did this, the dough was very lumpy and not smooth. And you can see here how it's not even sticking to the side of the bowl anymore. It's really absorbed. The flour has really absorbed all of the water, and it's becoming very stretchy and pliable, and it's very nice to work with. It is, again, more of a wetter dough, but it's still a very easily manageable dough. So you can see here, even just after an hour of these stretch and folds, how much the dough has changed. During this period, your dough isn't necessarily going to rise a ton, but it will change in its texture and the feel of the dough. So you can see how it's starting to get more lax and spread out into the bowl more. Here I'm adding some oil just because I didn't want to continue to add more water to the dough since it was already so wet. And you can do that. Oil in bread also extends the shelf life and creates a softer, more tender crumb. So it is beneficial to add the oil. So I'm using it as like a dual purpose. I'm incorporating it into the dough, but I'm also using it to help make it more manageable. So you can see here how shiny and smooth this dough has changed just in a matter of 2 hours. All right, so it's been a little over 2 hours. And right here, I'm just manipulating the dough and getting it set up in the bowl with a tiny bit more oil. I am going to let this dough rise overnight in the fridge because it's already been going so long through the day that I was afraid I would overproof it. So this dough was in the fridge, I believe 2 days before I actually got back to it. I had the intention of doing it the next morning, but I didn't get to it. So the dough was in the fridge, and that's actually very helpful because this is a wetter dough, so whenever it is in the fridge, it becomes much stiffer and much easier to work with. So whenever we're ready to make our loaves, you can shape ciabatta into little individual rolls, or you can do 2 long loaves, which is what I'm going to do here. It makes an excellent sandwich bread for breakfast sandwiches because the outside is crusty, the inside is very soft and tender. So it's very, we really enjoy making breakfast sandwiches and they freeze really well. So I'm just going to sprinkle a piece of parchment in the top of my dough liberally with flour. You can see it fell right out of there. And it is still very wet, so I would have preferred this dough be a little bit easier to handle and a little less hydrated, but it is what it is. It's still workable, and you'll see here as I manipulate it. So then I'm sprinkling the under portion of the dough and the rest of the sides of the parchment here with flour. Typically with like a yeast-style dough, you wouldn't want to add extra flour, but this dough here can really benefit from it just because it is so wet. So now this is the really easy part of ciabatta and why I feel that is an excellent beginner sourdough bread. You are not kneading it, you're just doing those stretch and folds. And then you don't have to shape this into a loaf. You dump it out like I did here, and then I'm just going to divide it into 2 long loaves. Now, usually I have a metal bench scraper that I really like to use, but it tends to cut through my parchment. So since this was a wetter dough, I just didn't want any holes in the parchment. So here, my plastic one isn't as sharp, so it's giving me a little trouble, but I'm just using it to divide this into 2 long loaves. And you can do this however, you just don't want to press down too much on the dough itself, only where you're slicing, because you don't want to deflate all of those air bubbles. So I'm just slicing it into the 2 loaves. And then here at this point, if you wanted to make individuals, you could divide individual little like rolls or buns. You could divide this into 4 or 6 or 8 portions on each loaf. But I'm just going to bake it like this, and then I will slice it up after. So all you have to do is exactly what you just saw me did there. Now what I'm going to do now is just aesthetic. I'm just going to make this a little more uniform, a little more even. I'm going to move around and get a better, smoother, just more aesthetically pleasing loaf of ciabatta here. Now, if you're following my recipe, you'll recognize that I said after doing my stretch and folds, I placed this dough into the refrigerator. So that means I skipped the bulk rise on the counter until the dough doubled. So the bulk rise is your main rise, and during that time, your dough is developing gluten and strength, and the yeast and bacteria are feeding and creating those air pockets and doubling your dough. Now, I put mine in the refrigerator, so it didn't double in the bowl, but the yeast and bacteria were sort of just in hibernation. I kind of just pressed pause. So it was still happening, just at a very reduced rate. So when I took this dough out, it hadn't necessarily doubled in the bowl, but it had grown a little bit, and I could tell that the dough was ready for its next rise, which is after the bulk rise, you do a divide, shape, and bake. So I divided my dough, and I'm very gentle here. You can see how I'm shaping it. You don't want to deflate any of those air pockets and press down on your dough hard. So I divided it, and then I shaped it, which ciabatta, there isn't much to that step, but say you were baking a round boule, that you would shape. And then you're going to do one more proofing. It's a rise, it's called the proof, and you're going to let this rest for about 2 hours. Now this dough, you're going to let it rest covered in a warm spot for 2 hours, roughly 2 hours. It's not going to necessarily double, but as you'll see here, it is poofier. So our dough is now ready to bake. So you can see here that it didn't necessarily double, but it did get poofier. The dough did grow, and you can see those little air bubbles and air pockets, so that it is still fermenting actively and very well. So we're going to put this in a 425-degree oven for about 20 minutes. And are these not so beautiful? We got a great oven spring. These are nice, tall ciabatta loaves. And right now I am going to break one of the rules of bread baking that I do try to follow, and I don't follow many. But I try not to slice into a very hot loaf on the regular, because it does tend to make the inside of your bread gummy. If you slice into it when it's very hot, all that steam escapes, and it tends to make your crumb very gummy. But for the sake of natural lighting, I wanted to slice this and give you guys some good photos. Now, this bread freezes really, really well. So if you want to do what I do and make several loaves of this at one time, you can take this completely cooled loaf, unsliced, wrap it tightly in plastic wrap and then in foil, and place it into the freezer. To reheat, you'll just remove the plastic and pop it in the oven at 350 just until warmed through. This bread also makes an excellent vessel for a sandwich, a breakfast sandwich, and most of all, we really enjoy this as a side to hot chicken noodle soup or any soup. It is delicious, and our family really, really enjoys this. I hope you guys try this out. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I will answer them. And I pray your time here has been blessed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel.